Before the New Testament was written down, it was transmitted and preserved through an oral tradition. We've already explained in this series the transmission of the New Testament through manuscripts is reliable, but what about the oral transmission before it was written down? The moment skeptics hear this, they immediately assume it is unreliable and go right to the analogy of the telephone game. How can the New Testament be reliable if it was preserved through word of mouth? Wouldn't doctrinal changes be easy to insert? The problem is this is really one giant attempt to judge another completely different culture with our own Western cultural views. People in the modern West have a hard time understanding how ancient people could retain large amounts of detailed teachings, since we live in a culture that is flooded with written information and several ways to record and reference things. Ancient people didn't have this technology, and instead used various techniques to train their memories to retain vast amounts of detailed information. Using these techniques today, combined with hard work and dedication, can yield the same strong memory skills. The Talmud describes an ideal student should be as a well-plastered cistern, which would not let even a single drop escape. Ancient Jews were capable of memorizing large amounts of scripture, and ancient Greek storytellers were able to memorize the entire Iliad or Odyssey. The other point is the transmission of important stories and teachings through oral tradition doesn't compare at all to the modern version of the telephone game. The point of the telephone game is to skew the message for a good laugh. It is transmitted secretly from one ear to the next, and there is no chance to hear the message repeatedly before it is passed on. This is not a good representation of how the transmission of important teachings were preserved through oral tradition. Ancient cultures transmitted oral teachings and sacred beliefs in the open for the whole tribe or community to hear, and it was repeated many times for all those present to memorize. If someone would skew the message during reciting, the whole community would be present to correct errors.
If you go back 2,000 years, oral tradition was the way that sacred beliefs, personal family information, tribal and national patriotic traditions were passed along. Education was almost entirely by rote memorization. It was not unusual for Greek school children to have Homer's Iliad or Odyssey or large portions of it committed to memory, or for young Jewish boys to have large parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, committed to memory.
Most of all, it is important to look at what scholars actually say regarding oral tradition. Do academic scholars and historians who have studied oral tradition in various cultures treat it like the telephone game? Hardly. In fact, they say many in the West have overlooked the value and preservation that can be found in oral transmission among various cultures. Tony Lentz says, Western academic measurement of success by literacy and printed research colored the expectation of classical scholars as they considered writing in ancient culture. Writing was so important to their world that they assumed it was key to the growth of ancient culture. Johannan Draper says, embedded oral forms and traditions allow people to remember astonishing amounts of material, while at the same time ensuring that the material is to some extent fluid and adaptable. For instance, the praise poems of the Zulu kings, collected by Trevor Cope, show both stability and partial verbatim agreement from one performance to another, but also considerable variety in the ordering and choice of possible components to suit the occasion. Kenneth Bailey worked for years in the Middle East and speaks of people retaining large amounts to memory and accurately preserving historical data orally for several years. We are here observing a community that can create over the centuries and sustain in current usage up to 6,000 wisdom sayings. Notice he said the community preserved the sayings. It was not dependent on one man, but on a collective group working together to preserve the tradition. Scholars note ancient people put a strong emphasis on memorization and developed several techniques for training one's memory. David Carr notes in Mesopotamia, more advanced students appear to have learned through a process of dictation and recitation. Students not only had to memorize individual elements of standard works, but also had to be able to place a text they had memorized in the correct order. This is very similar to how modern actors are able to memorize large amounts of lines and monologues to recite on stage. Ancient teachers would often repeat their teachings over and over and have their students repeat it back to them so they would commit it to memory. People from the ancient world up to the medieval world put such a strong emphasis on memory that Mary Carruthers says, a person without memory, if such a thing could be, would be a person without moral character, and in the basic sense, without humanity. And this was no exception in ancient Judea. David Carr notes Josephus recorded Jews could recite their laws easier than their own names. It was not uncommon for a Jew to have the entire Old Testament memorized by age 14. They took the book of Proverbs seriously when it said to write the law on the tablet of their heart. This was a culture that Jesus and the apostles were born and raised in. Memorization of large amounts of teachings in Scripture was the standard, so there is no reason to assume the disciples of Jesus could not retain and memorize large amounts of his teachings. Such a duty would have been expected in becoming a disciple of a rabbi. With that being said, we must recognize there are two forms of oral tradition, controlled and uncontrolled. A controlled oral tradition means that the material is memorized and identified as a preserved tradition. It is not meant to change, but be preserved. Whereas an uncontrolled oral tradition is a living tradition, which is subject to variations as the community or tribe needs. There is no set teacher and no control within which the material is passed from one person to another, and is open to additions. So the question becomes, what was the New Testament, a controlled or uncontrolled tradition? The obvious solution is to look at the surviving texts of the earliest Christians and see how they viewed the words of Jesus, and see if we can find structures for memory enhancement. If memory-enhancing structures exist in the text, we have a clear indication the text was meant to be memorized and preserved, not changed throughout time. There is, in fact, plenty of evidence in the New Testament which indicates a controlled tradition. First, we already indicated the culture they were raised in put a strong emphasis on memorization and preserving tradition. But also, Jesus taught in much the same way Jewish rabbis of his day taught, a pupil-teacher relationship with his disciples. He spent time instructing them and expected them to obey and imitate him. Samuel Breiskog notes, Jesus expected his disciples to use him as a model. More importantly, the disciples and early Christians considered Jesus God's divine agent. His words would have been considered sacred. As Harold Reisenfeld said, the words and deeds of Jesus are a holy word, comparable with that of the Old Testament, and the handing out of this precious material is entrusted to special persons. On top of that, we find several techniques in the New Testament for enhancing memorization. First, Jesus taught lessons through stories and visuals. He is constantly explaining his message in parables, which are easier to memorize. Most common people today can explain some of the most popular parables, like the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Sons. Teaching this way allows one to memorize easier. He also gave visuals in shorter lessons. Examples like Mark 10:25, where it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. Or like Matthew 7, where Jesus speaks in hyperbole of getting the log out of your eye before getting the speck out of someone else's. These visuals are frequent throughout the Gospels. Third, Jesus used elements of wordplay. In Matthew 23, Jesus gives a retort to the Pharisees, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. The Aramaic words were likely chosen because of the play on similarities and rhythmic delivery. Fourth, and most important, scholars like Robert Stein and David Edward Ahn estimate 80% of Jesus' teachings are what you would call a parallelismus membarum, which is to give a sentence in a similar form so that the passage has a pattern and rhythm. There are several examples we could point to, like Luke 11:9. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find it. Knock and it will be opened to you. Or Matthew 7:17. Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. There is an overwhelming amount of research which points this out. Thus, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence which indicates Jesus taught a controlled tradition in a way to enhance memorization. This should be pretty obvious to our culture, since many modern catchphrases we could rattle off the top of our heads come from Christ, such as go an extra mile, being a prodigal son, or a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, skeptics may try to argue these passages were made up years later by the church. However, that is a baseless conjecture. A community creating an uncontrolled tradition would have no need to make up the facade of a controlled tradition in order to fool people hundreds of years later, or put into the text an unnecessary amount of subtle hints and off-the-cuff comments of a controlled oral tradition. The burden is on the skeptic to explain why a community would feel a need to make these things up, because the fact remains there is plenty of evidence which presents a preserved controlled tradition, and it is far more parsimonious than assuming an elaborate conspiracy without any direct evidence. Plus, if the words of Jesus were made up later to suit the needs of an early Christian community, why don't they reflect actual problems the early church faced? Why were the teachings of Christ not invented to suit their needs, such as later problems like if Gentiles needed to be circumcised, or what was the place for speaking in tongues, or what the resurrected body would be like? If the words of Jesus were later invented to suit the needs of early Christians, why don't we find phrases that suit every need of early Christians? It is clear the teachings of Christ were preserved, not made up to suit the needs of a later community. It is also important to point out this way of teaching will encourage memorization of important doctrines and teachings, not necessarily exact wordings. But as we've seen in part 2 of this series, exact wording is not what is important, but the preservation of the teachings and historical accounts. Variations in delivery can change as long as the same message is given. So when skeptics try to claim it is a huge deal we do not have the exact words Jesus spoke, they miss the point. The New Testament was meant to preserve the teachings of Christ. It is the message of the gospel that saves, not specific words. There is really no difference in message if one reports, "And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold," or, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple." As Jocelyn Small says, for oral cultures, it is not the words, but the story or the gist that counts. As long as what was really important was stated, how it was stated was not the issue. As N.T. Wright says, if we come to the ministry of Jesus as first-century historians and forget our 20th century assumptions about mass media, the overwhelming probability is that most of what Jesus said, he said not twice, but 200 times, with of course a myriad of local variations. Evidence for this is seen in Matthew and Luke's different renders of the Lord's Prayer. In Luke, Jesus states it after he is approached by his disciples while praying, and in Matthew, Jesus is reciting it in a Sermon on the Mountain. Christ, of course, ministered for approximately 3 years and would have repeated the same message to different crowds, which would have encouraged memorization among his closest disciples and followers. The essential doctrines and teachings would have been hammered into their memories. As John Wyndham said, "It is exceedingly unlikely that Jesus taught about prayer only once. It is natural that he should have given the Lord's Prayer in his ask, seek, knock sayings more than once, and not always in identical words." Last, there is a clear indication specific eyewitnesses and followers of Jesus were trusted in preserving this tradition. Luke begins his gospel by telling us he received his information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Luke uses the Greek word huperetes, which is the Greek word for the Hebrew word hazan. The hazan in Judea was responsible for keeping the scrolls in the synagogue. So in Luke 1:2, we read he received his information from the hazans of the word. The usage of the single definite article in Luke makes it likely that these were carefully selected eyewitnesses who were trusted with keeping the oral tradition in check. Therefore, we have evidence the tradition was protected and preserved by designated authoritative eyewitnesses.
If you remember in Acts chapter 1, when Judas is being replaced, the requirement for his replacement is that he had to be with the ministry from the beginning. And the reason is that the apostles had a role in overseeing this tradition. In fact, Luke refers to those who orally reported the tradition in the churches as those who are eyewitnesses and ministers of the word from the beginning. So this role of the apostles exercises a control in how this material is being passed on from church to church.
Even if all this evidence was not available, the idea that Christian doctrines and accounts of Jesus drastically changed before they were written down is refuted by the fact that scholars have identified several early oral creeds and hymns quoted in the New Testament. These creeds and hymns demonstrate a preserved oral tradition that predate Paul's letters. If Paul was writing between the 40s and 60s, then he is quoting creeds and beliefs which existed prior to this. Most notably, the overwhelming majority of scholars date the creed preserved in 1 Corinthians 15 to within 3 years of Pentecost, which, as Gary Habermas points out, preserves the core doctrines of Christ's death, resurrection, and divinity. Therefore, we have evidence of essential Christian doctrines in creeds written down by Paul that existed before the New Testament was written. This is by far the closest we get with any ancient document. The fact that some of our material is dated to within 3 years of the source is unheard of with other ancient literature. But even if these creeds did not exist, the idea the oral tradition would have been corrupted is unsupported and is nothing but paranoid suspicion. Scholars estimate the reliability of an oral tradition can last for over a century before we could expect corruption to seep in. Gilbert Garahan says it cannot go past 150 years. Marlene Kiklamani sets the limit at 200 years. This is well within the time frame of when the New Testament was written down, even if we take the latest dates for when the books were written. Therefore, when we actually look at the evidence, we see there is no reason to doubt the oral tradition of the New Testament, and there is plenty of evidence that indicates its reliability.